What's up, everyone, and welcome to our next mini-series episode. Today we're talking about the best team in the league, the Buffalo Bills. They finished last year 10-6. They did not win their division because New England is still in the division, but they did make the playoffs for the second out of 3 years. They were bounced in the wild card round by the Houston Texans, 22-19. That game actually went to overtime. It was a heartbreaker for me personally, but we're not here to talk about the Bills' season. We're here to talk about the 2020 fantasy relevancy. This year, I got Josh Allen projected to go about 3,400 yards, 24 touchdowns, passing, 10 interceptions, another 550 yards on the ground with six touchdowns. He's going to throw some interceptions on the ground for about
He might.
353 fantasy points. So he's I'm a little higher on him. I mean, he definitely offers some rushing upside. Definitely, he's up there with your Lamar Jacksons and your Deshaun Watsons of the rushing world. I think he takes a little bit of a leap as far as passing goes. He has improved. I mean, his first year he was pretty not good, and then last year he got better. I mean, he had a 1,000-yard receiver last year. His accuracy is definitely something that needs to be worked on, and that's been something since he came out of college that we knew, scouts knew, the team knew. So I mean, if he can work on his accuracy a little bit, he does have a couple new weapons in the offense here, and we'll talk about them. I mean, as a fan, I'm excited. As a fantasy player, I'm excited too because I mean, the rushing upside alone is what makes him a decent fantasy quarterback. And if he didn't offer that, then unfortunately he probably wouldn't be drafted in a lot of leagues. But behind him, you got the journeyman Matt Barkley, and then in the fifth round this year, they drafted Jake from State Farm. And I mean, none of them are really a direct threat to him. His rushing alone, taking a lot of hits, is something that you might want to consider. He has missed a handful of games in his career over the past 2 years, and Matt Barkley has had to step in, and he had a really excellent game against the Jets, and then he had some stinker games. But you're not, I mean, quarterbacks you don't handcuff, but you definitely keep an eye out for. If Josh Allen is banged up, then we'll see who the backup is. We're probably looking at Barkley with the weird off season that we're having now, but Jake Fromm kind of has like that winning quarterback attitude that you want, but he's another project. So, what's your thoughts on the quarterback room here? They stink.
It sucks. No, for me, I really wish that you could take Jake Fromm's accuracy and give it to Josh Allen because I think that he could be an elite quarterback then. Because it's kind of the opposite on Jake Fromm's end. People always complain that he didn't have a strong enough arm to make it in the NFL. So they just need to merge together and become one quarterback. But from a fantasy standpoint, Josh Allen last year was 10th in points per game. You already mentioned the rushing upside with 9 touchdowns last season. I don't need to beat a dead horse with his accuracy because it stinks, but if he can improve on that, which crazier things have happened. I mean, if not, he'll just end up like Jamarcus Russell and we'll forget who he is, but it's fine. But I from a fantasy standpoint, though, last season, I will give it, he was very consistent. He had very few games where he had, huge top 5 QB numbers, but almost on a weekly basis, he was a top 12 option. So he had 7 games as a top 12 QB last year, and that was one of the tops in the leagues behind all those big names you mentioned earlier, like Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, even Jameis was up there last season with his 30 interceptions. But I mean, so if you're looking for a very consistent option, I think Josh Allen's an excellent candidate. I personally like a little more upside and a little more volume in my passers. But he does offer that rushing floor. So I think his ceiling is limited, but his floor is also very high. So it just kind of depends on what your strategy is overall at the quarterback position.
And just one thing that gets overlooked a lot, you don't really you see the turnover numbers, but you don't see the actual like fumble numbers. He put the ball on the ground a lot throughout the course of the year, and I notice it more with him, obviously, because that's my team and that's who I watch. But he's that's another area where he's got to improve on. I mean, in most cases, either him or an offensive lineman was able to jump on the ball. But I mean, every time you're putting the ball on the ground, that's an opportunity for -2 points because of turnovers. So definitely keep that in mind too. Hopefully he improved there. I mean, he's got some big hands, so there's no reason why he can't hold on to the ball. Um, Moving into the running backs, an underwhelming position here. Singletary, I think pre-draft we were all semi-excited, thinking, okay, there's no way Frank Gore is going to come back. It's going to be Devin Singletary's backfield. He should definitely improve on what he did last year. But then they go out and draft a running back, and as a Bills fan, it really wasn't surprising that they drafted a running back. We kind of expected it, but they drafted a running back that is a guy that's probably going to vulture some touchdowns now. And on top of that, Josh Allen is going to vulture some touchdowns now. So Devin Singletary's only value is carries if you're in a point per carry league and yards. You're probably not going to get many touchdowns out of him. You're inside the 5, inside the 10. You're probably looking at a quarterback keep with Josh Allen or Zach Moss coming in. They're pounding it in. So it's underwhelming. I mean, Singletary's going in the same area as like your David Montgomerys, as your Mark Ingrams, and I'd probably rather have Ingram and Montgomery over Singletary at this point because of all the vulture opportunity that's back there for Buffalo. TJ Yeldon is still on the roster now. He really didn't do much last year when he came over. He is a good pass catcher out of the backfield, but that wasn't on display last year. Taiwan Jones I just want to bring his name up because he's the guy that kind of put Buffalo away in the playoffs last year. Deshaun Watson got out of, I mean, it was like a Madden glitch because he got hit, but he didn't go down. He found Taiwan Jones, and Taiwan Jones was able to get him into field goal range. So now he was the enemy, and now he's the friend. But yeah, I mean, it really only comes down to Singletary and Zach Moss. We don't really need to mention these other names, but those are the two that are going to be relevant. But it's hard to say. It's hard to be comfortable with Singletary as your RB2 comfortably every single week.
Yeah, the biggest thing, and I love Singletary's talent, and I'm a little disappointed because I was really hoping he could have. I say Miles Sanders breakthrough was what I was gonna say, but I guess Miles Sanders hasn't had his breakthrough yet, so I can't really say that. But I was really hoping that he had that upside that Miles Sanders has right now, and he was one of my guys, Devin Singletary, that is this off season. But the Zach Moss pick just it really worries me. When you look at Singletary last season, one of the reasons he was effective as a fantasy running back was because of his volume. He was a very volume-based player. He was on the field, and this surprised me a little bit, for 69% of the Bills' offensive plays, and that was the 10th most among all running backs in the NFL. And that's really surprising to see him on the field that much. And I think that's naturally going to come down when you look at his fantasy points per game. He was only 28th last season. So, he's a guy where he's probably going to lose a little bit of opportunity. So when you couple that together with him being on the field less opportunity, it just doesn't seem like the outlook is as bright as I was hoping it would be. The other piece I'm kind of interested in is to see how often they use him in the pass game. He has that stigma, I think, because he's a smaller back, that he was heavily involved in the pass game, but he only had 29 receptions last year, and that's not overly impressive. I talk about Joe Mixon not overly being involved in the pass game, and that's how many Joe Mixon had more than that last season. So, I really love Singletary, and I hope that he gets the opportunity, but I really do think that this is probably going to be a pretty classic timeshare here. You might be looking at a 60-40, or maybe it's even 65-35. But at the end of the day, Singletary's going to be on the field less. He's not going to be involved in the red zone, and so when you look at all of that, he doesn't offer a lot of upside. Now, when you look at where he's going right now in fantasy drafts, he's going off the board, as you said, like in that 25th running back range. So he offers, at that point, he's probably your flex. So I would say he doesn't offer a ton of value because I don't see the upside this season. But I think his ADP is fair. I like where Zach Moss is going a lot. He's going as the 53rd running back off the board right now, and it's feasible that you see him get 5 or 6 touchdowns this year, maybe 5 or 600 yards, and he has a nice rookie season. It's even possible that maybe they use him more than we're even talking. So I think he offers nice value there as a running back 5 that could provide flex value.
All right, and then moving on to the offensive line. That's it's one of the deeper positions on this team. We're going into the season with a lot of the same guys that was starting last year on the offensive line. The only thing that's not consistent really is where they're playing on the offensive line. McDermott has been juggling these guys around for a little bit now, trying to find that perfect combination. They actually just brought in the Brian Winters from the Jets, who just got released from them. So that's another guy that isn't even listed. The chart's not updated yet, but he's another guy to add into the mix. He started for the Jets before in this league. Actually, all of last year he started for them. But I mean the two most set positions right now are left tackle and center with Deion Dawkins and Mitch Morse. Cody Ford, he's jumbled around between tackle and guard. John Feliciano between tackle and guard. They brought in Quentin Spain. So all these guys were here last year in 2019, but the combination isn't set in stone just yet. So they can definitely. I mean, just chemistry alone is probably gonna boost them up a little bit. But where are they ranked on PFF?
If you had to guess, where do you think they're ranked on PFF?
13th.
13th? No, they're 18th. So PFF does make note that they do have depth, as you mentioned. They're one of the deeper offensive lines, but their starting unit needs to make a jump forward. That's essentially the notes that PFF has on it. But yeah, 18th right now, so kind of middle of the pack. But they do note that if there's some improvements and they're more consistent, that they could be a unit that sneaks into the top 12.
Oh, sorry, I was looking into the future. I didn't know what you're talking about right now. Going into the wide receivers, they made a semi big splash this offseason with the wide receivers. They brought in Stephon Diggs from the Minnesota Vikings. They traded a first round pick and some other picks in return. They got a pick in return too. So that kind of solidifies the number one, which is it was. It's not really a questionable move. It was just more of a like it's semi questionable because of the way that John Brown and Cole Beasley played last year. Now, obviously, if those guys were bums last year, the Stephon Diggs move makes a lot more sense. But John Brown and Cole Beasley were both pretty solid last year, and then they still bring in Stephon Diggs, which, again, it's not a surprising move because I think the Bills were planning on bringing in a wide receiver one way or another. Now, if they stayed at 22, maybe they draft Justin Jefferson, or maybe they draft T. Higgins or somebody else, Michael Pittman, somebody like that, and still end up bringing in a wide receiver with that pick that they traded to the Minnesota Vikings. But they trade that pick to the Minnesota Vikings. He's actually a guy that's succeeded in this league. He's one of the best route runners in this league. He's a top. He's finished as a wide receiver one before in this league, so it's coming to a similar situation where this team is going to be a little bit more balanced, like Minnesota was. So he could have similar numbers to last year, where he didn't really have a lot of targets, but he was effective with what he got. But it's basically those three. After that, they drafted Gabriel Davis in the 4th round, Isaiah Hodgins in the 6th round. They have Andre Roberts for special teams, Isaiah McKenzie for special teams. You're probably not looking at all of these guys making the roster, but those top three between Brown, Diggs, and Beasley are they're a good combination. And if Josh Allen is going to make a leap and go into being a QB1, consistent QB1, putting up some yards, it's going to come down to those three doing their thing.
Yeah, I mean, for wide receivers, it always comes down to how much volume do they see for me. So when you look at the Bills' passing game, they were 23rd in pass plays per game last year. And yeah, maybe they do bring that up to be a little more balanced, but I think you can expect from Diggs kind of what he did last season with Minnesota. He was 24th in points per game. He's currently going as the 27th wide receiver off the board. So, I think he doesn't provide a ton of value. I Just because I think the situation is going to be semi-similar, and you could argue that Kirk Cousins. Well, you can't really argue. Kirk Cousins is much more accurate than Josh Allen
Hmm.
at this point in his career, so that worries me a little bit. So I like Diggs. Some people are very low on Diggs. I think that he's a solid middle to back end wide receiver too, and I think that's kind of where he is. I will say the biggest thing that worries me is him and John Brown run very deep routes, so I think that they could be taking targets away from one another. So that's just kind of a side note, but John Brown's value I'm a little intrigued by, and I completely get why people are fading on John Brown. Stephon Diggs is a much more talented wide receiver than John Brown, and he should be more involved, but I mean, John Brown had a great season last year. He was 22nd in points per game, and he's being drafted as the 53rd wide receiver off the board. And for me that's tough. I want to say that he's worth a higher pick than that, but there's a lot of risk associated with this pick just because this is a very run-heavy team. They brought in a much more talented wide receiver, so where can John Brown realistically finish is it's a big question mark. I'd still take a chance on him at that point. I saw a lot of improvement from him last season, and as much as he's known as a guy that's more of a deep threat, I saw him improve as a route runner, and I think he's a little more than a deep threat now. So I was encouraged by him last season, and I'd definitely take a chance on him as the 53rd wide receiver, and he's proved that he can be a wide receiver too pretty consistently. Then wrapping it up with Cole Beasley, who's probably the last fantasy relevant one. You could stash their two young guys in your taxi squad. We'll see what they do in the future in terms of retaining these wide receivers, but if one of them was to walk, one of those young guys may be able to step in. So I'll put them on my taxi squad, but I'm not overly optimistic about them. Cole Beasley right now is the 71st wide receiver off the board. He had 105 targets last season, and he was 38th in points per game. So, when you talk about 38th in points per game, but he's going off the board as the 71st wide receiver, there's a lot of value there in PPR leagues. This is a guy, especially if you play in leagues where you play 4 wide receivers, which I do play in leagues like that. I mean, this is a guy that can be your 4th wide receiver and provide a lot of value. And to me, he's not competing with Diggs or John Brown for those longer targets. He kind of owns the short routes for the Bills. So, and he had over 100 targets. I think that kind of goes beyond a lot of people's head, and I think he'll continue to have a similar production to last season.
Yeah, just going back to Brown and Diggs a little bit, a couple points that I wanted to make that I forgot about. Brown actually had, sorry, he had 10 games in a row to start the season where he had at least 50 yards. So even if, well, not if, when Diggs moves into that number one role there, that's a lot of that potential is going to go to where Diggs is. He's going to get targeted, and I mean, Josh Allen was able to make John Brown work. So I mean, Diggs is going to be able to work too. I think the thing that gets the most flack, and it's not even fancy related, but the thing that gets the most flack with Diggs is he was traded the same day that DeAndre Hopkins was traded, and the
Yeah.
package for DeAndre Hopkins was a lot a lot more favorable for the Cardinals than what the package for Stephon Diggs was. But I mean, I think it's a good fit. There's not really that big possession receiver. I mean, they drafted Gabriel Davis to kind of be the bigger guy, because a lot of these other guys, John Brown, Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, they're hovering right around 6 foot, if not. I mean, that's probably with their cleats on, walking on cement. But they're for the way that I think this offense is going to run. I think it's a good trio. And then their tight ends, a little lackluster in the tight end department. They got Dawson Knox, who was a rookie last year, who had a handful of drops. So we're hoping to see an improvement from him there. He seems to be slotted in as the number one there. They went out and brought in Tyler Kroft last offseason, who has been, I mean, if your name is Tyler and you were a tight end for the Bengals, then you have an injury history, and that's exactly what he is. He's if he could stay on the field, that's another solid option for Josh Allen. But who knows when he's going to be on the field because of the three receivers and Dawson Knox and Devin Singletary. So it's probably going to be more of a one receiver or one tight end set in a lot of formations. Um, if they do run two, then it's probably looking at Dawson Knox and Tyler Croft.
Yeah, so starting with Dawson Knox, I was a little surprised to see that he was fifth among all tight ends in average target distance. So he actually was running routes that were not really shorter, they were more intermediate routes. So I was a little surprised to see that. I think a lot of people have him pegged as kind of a security blanket kind of guy, but that's not really what his game was last season. Yeah, and you already mentioned the drops, and I mean that's a huge concern. You have to build trust with your quarterback. He was number one among all tight ends in his drop rate last season. So, not only did he struggle, he didn't pass the eye test statistically too. He did lead the league in drops or drop rate, I should say, among tight ends. So I'm not overly high on Dawson Knox. We've already mentioned John Brown, Diggs, Cole Beasley, and this is a run first offense. I don't think that it can sustain another pass catcher, and I think that's my biggest knock on Dawson Knox. So I'm not necessarily drafting him.
All right, and then the special teams, like we mentioned, Andre Roberts is pretty much their punt returner. He's not really a fantasy relevant player, but um, if you do play in like a special teams only, or you play with you have a punt returner or a return man slot only. Andre Roberts is just as good as any, especially with the defense that we're going to talk about. They're going to be causing teams to punt it, so Andre Roberts is going to have some opportunity to put up some punt return yards and points. Micah Hyde also returns punts, and we're going to talk about him. So if you're in an IDP league and your IDPs are able to get punt return yards, then that's another one that we're probably going to talk about. And then in the kick return game, Taiwan Jones and Devin Singletary. Singletary is probably going to be drafted in most leagues, so that's an added bonus. And Taiwan Jones is probably not going to be drafted in most leagues, and it kind of goes in the Andre Roberts category where you specifically have to have a return position. But I'd probably rather have Andre Roberts over Taiwan Jones there. And then kicking the field goals and the extra points. Stephen Hauschka has been there for a couple of years now. He has had some struggles, but he is still pretty accurate. It's another situation, kind of like when we talked about Philadelphia up here in the Northeast. We do get some pretty bad winter games. We have an open air stadium here. They did draft a kicker, which says a little bit of something because most kickers you can just pick up. I mean, I don't think there's a kicker that's if you go through all 32 teams, there's probably like four kickers that were originally drafted by their original team because you get camp battles all the time, and then two kickers are cut, and then all of a sudden they become starters on another team. So, I mean, that doesn't sound good for Tyler Bass, but basically what I'm trying to say is like you just like all these kickers are just bounced around. Tyler Bass was actually drafted, so that must mean that they're looking to either move on from Hauschka or create a competition there. And they also have an undrafted guy by the name of Kari Vedvik, but he can also punt, and the punting was not really good last year with Corey Borkas. So he's listed as a kicker and a punter, but I don't think he wins both jobs. If he wins any job, it might be punting. So then he's not really relevant at all. It's probably going to come down to Tyler Bass and Stephen Hauschka. So any thoughts on the kick game here?
I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me, and I've said this before, but I mean, if you could find a guy that kicks and punts, I mean, you could use that roster spot on something else. So, I mean, I actually think that's pretty cool, and I'm surprised there's not more teams out there that don't find players like that. So, just a side note there.
Not
But you
even
kind of
fine,
mentioned,
but couldn't you just like teach them? I mean,
yeah, I mean, you would think so. Obviously, they have the leg strength, and I know there's a lot of intricacies with punting because you try to pin it in the corner, get the right spin on the ball, but I mean, it seems like you would have enough time to teach these guys because you can only practice kicking field goals so many times.
where's Pat
So,
McAfee to come out of
yeah,
retirement and just be a kicking coach somewhere?
he could definitely do it. But, I mean, you already mentioned it. Between the weather, Hauschka with the Bills hasn't really had a ton of fantasy success. They just haven't kicked a ton of field goals. He was 22nd last year. He's another guy where just based on his name recognition alone, because he's been in the league for a while, going back to when he was with the Seahawks. So he almost always in leagues I'm in is drafted, and he really isn't going to provide any value there. So I would not take him.
Yeah, I mean, he's probably going to be drafted in my home leagues. There's no doubt about that. Or unless it comes down to Tyler Bass, and Bass might be drafted in my home leagues. But yeah, again, it's we don't really like kickers that kick in the kind of environment that Buffalo plays in. But this is probably one of those situations where the offense is going to be able to move the ball, but who knows how they're going to be effective in the red zone. So maybe they are kicking more field goals. I guess we'll find out as the season goes on. And then getting into the defense as a whole, this is one of the better defenses in the league, probably top five. Put them up there with Pittsburgh. Put them up there with New England. They can get to the ball. They can get to the quarterback. They have excellent duo as far as their safeties go. They got one of the better young linebackers in the league. It's just top to bottom. They are, and not even homering, they are one of the best units in the entire league. Ed Oliver is, if you have to play a defensive lineman, he's as good as any. He can play out wide. He's a skinnier, not skinnier. He's a smaller frame for a defensive tackle. I mean, he was kind of in Houston in college. He played all over the defensive line, and he's kind of like a hybrid defensive end, but he does play a defensive tackle position, which are the guys that get to the quarterback for the sacks. Jerry Hughes, he's had some double sack seasons, kind of fell off a little bit the past couple of years, but he's another one that's on the edge there that can get to the quarterback. They drafted AJ Epinesa, who can also get to the quarterback. He was at some point he was projected as a high first round draft pick in the 2020 draft. Like, this was probably about a year and a half ago, and then obviously things changed. Burrow went up there, Chase Young went up there, different scouting reports came out, but just like Epinesa's talent alone, to get him in the second round was a steal in the draft, and he's definitely going to be on the field, so he could be a dynasty IDP edge rusher there. Tremaine Edmonds is the linebacker that I was talking about. That's one of the better young linebackers in the league, middle linebacker. You could pencil him in for about 150 tackles. Matt Milano is another one that gets a lot of tackles there. My personal favorite, and I know when you were talking about the Cowboys, you said that they had the best safety duo in the league. It might have been the Rams too. One of those two you said had the best safety duo in the league, but I personally think it's Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde. Those two are just, they feed off of each other. They get a ton of tackles. They cause a ton of turnovers. Tre'Davious White being back there in the cornerback position definitely helps Poyer and Hyde get those turnovers. Because he's a shutdown corner, so they have talent all over the board. You got plenty of IDPs, and this is a defense that's going to be drafted earlier than where you should normally be taking a defense, but they're going to put up some points.
Yeah, and I mean, this is definitely a talented defense. Last season, they finished 12th as a unit, so they're a surefire number one defense. I'll talk about a few individual guys here. Mario Addison has been very consistent throughout the course of his career, so if you're looking for sacks along that defensive line, 9.5 sacks, 11 sacks, 9 sacks, 9.5 sacks, very consistent over the past few years. Tremaine Edmonds, you already mentioned, over 100 tackles in his first 2 seasons in the league, and I expect him to continue to improve, especially if you're in an IDP Dynasty League. He's one of the top guys to go after. I've seen him go pretty high, like one of the top 5 linebackers in most IDP leagues that I'm in. Kind of interesting. He only finished 29th last season at the linebacker position, but once again, it depends very heavily on your scoring. This was standard Fantasy Pro scoring. So Matt Milano also had over 100 tackles, more of a sleeper guy there. He's not their primary tackle threat there with Edmonds, but kind of an under the radar guy. In terms of safeties, they're definitely in contention for one of the best duos in terms of fantasy production. Overall, from just a safety duo, they're arguably one of the top ones. From a fantasy standpoint, they're also up there. Jordan Poyer is a consensus top 5 DB, had over 100 tackles each of the past 2 seasons. He was sixth in scoring last year. I mean, he's a no-brainer or a pick in your IDP leagues. I'm not as high on Micah Hyde. I've always respected Micah Hyde as a playmaker, and I think he's very valuable in real life, but he's never gone over 75 tackles at the safety position. So I think there's guys with higher upside there, but in real life, this is a dynamic duo for sure. And I think overall, I would probably take Tremaine Edmonds number one on this IDP or IDP wise, and I think I'd prefer their defense as a whole, though. I mean, this is just a really strong unit. And you mentioned some other names like Ed Oliver, who I loved watching him. And I actually watched a few Houston games because of Ed Oliver, and he was supposed to be a beast coming out. So I enjoyed watching him. You already mentioned Epinensa, who I think could be, you mentioned he was supposed to be top 5 at one point when you were looking at mock drafts before the season. So there's a ton of talent on this defense, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were a top 5 unit overall, just as at the end of the season.
And then the final thing I want to say about the defense too is we pretty much almost in every episode that we've done, I always talk about the number one corner, but in fantasy you kind of want to stay away from the corner. This is especially true here. Teams don't throw at Tre'Davious White, and if they do, they don't have success against Tre'Davious White. He didn't allow a touchdown last year. He was tied for the league lead in interceptions with Stephon Gilmore. Gilmore did have more pick sixes than Tre'Davious White, so he finished higher. But teams don't throw at Tre'Davious White, and it's for good reason. But with that being said, they brought in Josh Norman to play on the other side. And if he ends up making it out of camp and winning that second cornerback job, that is a corner that I might be intrigued in grabbing if I have to play a cornerback. We know what he can do and what he has done in the past. And now, obviously, he's older than what he was in Carolina. But, I mean, you don't just, you do lose a step. That there's no doubting that, but you don't lose your you don't really lose your skill, and we know that he can do that. And his defensive coordinator, when he was with Carolina, is now the head coach in Buffalo. If teams are avoiding Tre'Davious White, that means more balls might be going Josh Norman's way, which gives him opportunity for some fantasy points. The last couple of years in Washington, when he was called upon to be the number one, it didn't really work out. Plus, Washington's defense wasn't that good. Plus, their team overall wasn't that good. Now that he doesn't have the pressure of being the number one, he could not go back because he never was a number two, but now he can be a number two, and he doesn't have that pressure because Tre'Davious White is on the other side, just shutting down teams' number ones. Josh Norman definitely has a chance to put up some numbers if he's starting on the opposite side. And then I mean, our final thoughts on it. They finished, like I said, they finished last year in the division 10-6, second overall in the division, behind the Patriots, who finished 12-4. Obviously, the big news of the offseason, not just in the division, but just in the whole offseason, is Tom Brady's time in New England is done. He's now down in Tampa Bay, which kind of opens this division up. We've talked on different episodes, and I mean, there's been some big major moves since we actually did our Jets episode, so they're even worse than when we talked about them originally. But they're not really a threat. Miami has improved. I don't think they're going to make that jump this year, but they're definitely going to be. I mean, they're a young team to definitely look out for. But it's a two-horse race between the Bills and the Patriots. Obviously, we didn't do our Patriots episode yet, but it's no secret they did bring in Cam Newton. They still have Bill Belichick. I think that even with those, with Belichick and Cam Newton, I think the Bills have a chance to finally take over in this division. It's all on Josh Allen's shoulders, though. I could see like an 11-5 season, possibly 12-4. They do have a little rough schedule. They play the NFC West and the AFC West this year, so they got some tough games in there. But the Kansas City game is in Buffalo, so that's favorable there. Pittsburgh game is in Buffalo, so that's favorable there. So a couple of their tougher games are in Buffalo, even though there might not be a crowd. It's still the environment and all that stuff. They have the game announcers and all that, so they might be able to feed off of that. I could see them winning this division finally and knocking New England off.
Yeah, I mean, on paper, the Bills have the best roster in this division. But there's a reason that they play the game, so we'll see how it shakes out for them. I mean, I would expect the Bills to win this division, but I don't know. Deep down, you know how Bill Belichick is. I will say my biggest concern, I think, with the Patriots now are all these players opting out, and they might not be guys that are overly fantasy relevant, but these are guys that contribute to the Patriots' overall success. So that does concern me a little bit. So we'll have to see the final opt-out list, but I would expect the Bills to take this division. You mentioned the schedule. That's one of the reasons I don't think I'd peg them for more wins than they had last year. I'd expect them to probably sit at 10, maybe 11. They're more talented than that, but that schedule is really challenging. So I think they should take the crown home, but they still gotta overcome the Patriots. That's a reality. The Patriots, as of right now, are still the kings of the division until dethroned and otherwise.
All right, so there you have it, and we'll see you guys next episode.